Hey guys, my name is Rachel Givens, and this is my Critical Performance 1 for SEC 352 at WKU, and we did a textbook analysis. My textbook that I did was American Anthem, Modern American History, and the authors were Ayers, De La Teja, Schusslinger, and White. The publisher was Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, published in 2007. The grade level that this textbook is projected to go by is 11th grade, and I analyzed chapters 6, 11, 14, and 18. These chapters correlated with the diversity questions that I was aiming to answer. And the citation is listed as follows. First, what I'm going to do is see if the textbook that I analyzed accurately met the National United States History Standards. The three eras that I looked at were Era 7, the emergence of modern America, which was the time period of 1890 to 1930. Era 8, which is the Great Depression and World War II, with the time period being 1929 to 1945. And Era 9, post-war United States, which was 1945 to the early 1970s. When looking at the textbook, I wanted to answer this question. Does the text accurately meet the National United States History Standards? I was evaluating each standard based on a 5-point scale. Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. First, take Era 7. I checked and agreed that the text did correlate with the national standards. Next was Era 8. I strongly agreed that the text accurately met the National United States History Standards. Then I looked at Era 9. I also agreed that Era 9 accurately met the National United States History Standards and went along with the textbook. After addressing whether the text correlated with the National United States History Standards, I wanted to address the diversity of the text. My first question that I wanted to answer was what were some of the various types of economic diversity that were addressed throughout the text. When looking at Chapter 11 that covered the Great Depression, the book covered the distribution of wealth that those that experienced the Great Depression. According to the text, 70% of the nation's families had an income below the level that they needed in order to achieve a proper standard of living. The highest paid 5% of workers who had jobs received 70% of the nation's total income. The remaining 95% of the combined population of the United States received only 30% of the nation's wealth that had to be divided between everyone and their families. This is the graph that I created in order to provide a visual example of the distribution of wealth in the U.S. during the Great Depression. In my graph, the colors in each column coordinate with each other. The orange goes in the first column, goes with the orange in the second column, and the pink in each column as well. In the first column, you see at the top the 5% of workers, which correlates in the second column with the 70% that represented the country's wealth at the time during the U.S. Great Depression. Then, in the first column, you see the 95% of workers that was represented that received only 30% of the country's wealth in the U.S. When looking at the data, it is safe to say that the question of economic diversity is addressed. However, the book does not give specific in the fact that there is no breakdown of socioeconomic status throughout the chapter. The book just gives a basic and overall generalized percentage for the population, and there is no breakdown of the wealth for the entire population. Therefore, the reader is not able to see how each various socioeconomic class is inadvertently affected by the stock market crash and the Great Depression as a whole. This unfortunately does create a flaw in the text. The next question that I wanted to address was, when looking at the data of the economic diversity of the Great Depression, does the text show any correlation between economic diversity and racial diversity? Other than covering the percentage of wealth and the distribution of that wealth throughout the U.S. after the crash, the textbook did not discuss how this breakdown of the economic situation and the downturn not only affected different economic groups or different racial groups in the population. The book simply did not address any racial groups during this time period. It just covered the Great Depression and what happened during the occurrence. The book basically gave a general overview of the event itself and how it was affecting the general U.S. population as a whole, and not a breakdown of each individual diverse racial group. This creates another flaw in the textbook. The next question that I wanted to address was, when analyzing the pictures throughout the text, are there generally a range of races and minority groups depicted during the Civil Rights Movement? Throughout the Civil Rights Movement, there is this generalized sense that the only race that was fighting for their infringed rights were African Americans. This generalization is not the case. There were various other groups, not just racial, that were also trying to achieve civil rights as well, some of which are women, Jews, and other religious groups, immigrants, and other cultural minorities. Upon analyzing the pictures throughout Chapter 18 in the text that covers the chapter on civil rights, the only races and groups that were addressed and depicted in the chapter were African Americans and Caucasians. This is the chart that I came up with that shows the race depicted in the photos during the Civil Rights Movement. When looking at the chart, you can see that African Americans were shown throughout the chapter 52 times, and Caucasians were depicted only 15 times. Upon looking at the text, no other racial groups or minority groups were identified and covered during the Civil Rights Movement. The movement wasn't simply about African American groups. This creates yet another flaw in the content of the textbook. The students need to understand that there simply wasn't just a singular group that was included in the Civil Rights Movement. This creates an understanding that is inaccurate and therefore leads to a generalized conclusion that the student will receive that is incorrect. The next question, diversity question that I wanted to address was, are women and men depicted in the text when referencing the women's suffrage movement equally, or is there a shift in one gender often being represented more than another? During the women's suffrage movement, most people think of Ida B. Wells, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other prominent women who were at the forefront of the women's suffrage movement. It's stereotypical for readers to believe that only women were actively involved in the movement in order to promote their own views. Upon analyzing Chapter 6 in the textbook, the information stated in the text itself shows that there were occasional men that were actively engaged during the women's rights movement. I created this chart entitled it Men and Women Leaders During the Women's Suffrage Movement. What I did was counted the many prominent leaders that were included in the text during the women's suffrage movement. The number of women that were listed in the text was 11, and the number of men that was listed in the text was at the number of 3. This graph does prove that there were men that were actively involved in the women's suffrage movement. The text disproves a general stereotypes and assumptions that the reader would have before reading Chapter 6. Even though there aren't a significant number of prominent active men that were involved in comparison to those women that were involved, the preconceived notion that no men were involved is therefore exterminated. This part of the text is accurate in the sense that it seems to be very insightful in proving that men were also actively involved as well in the movement. The final question that I wanted to address in my analysis was in regards to Chapter 14 covering the Holocaust. Did the text reference other religions that were persecuted than simply those of the Jewish faith? During the Holocaust, those of the Jewish faith in Europe were targeted for their beliefs, as well as other religions such as Gypsies, Catholics, and Jehovah's Witnesses, to name a few. The textbook covered the typical targeting of those of the Jewish faith and the obstacles that those people had to face during that brutal time period. However, the textbook only states in a singular paragraph that these were some of the other groups that were targeted during the Holocaust. According to the data in the textbook, the number of Jews that were killed during the Holocaust was at 6 million deaths, and the number of those who were of another religious affiliation other than Jewish was at 5 million deaths. This is the chart that I created in order to look at the percentages of Jewish people killed in the Holocaust in comparison to other religions. The 45% that you see in the other religion correlates with the 5 million people that were killed during the Holocaust. Then you see the Jewish percentage. This is at 55%, which correlates with the 6 million people that were killed during the Holocaust. The textbook is flawed when referencing to the other religions that were prosecuted during the Holocaust. It does not identify what specific religious groups were targeted. However, it does not give a specific and separate breakdown of the individual groups in that 5 million other religions of the total of each group. The text specifically states that each specific group had this many deceased during the time, which could have been an influential information if incorporated in the text. The final thing that I wanted to address was, does the Lexile score of the grade level itself match the actual text? The typical reader measures for the 11th and 12th grade is ranging from 940L to 1210L. The textbook American Anthem has an overall Lexile score of 1160L. Therefore, the Lexile score for the 11th grade students who would be assigned to read this textbook would be accurate with the range that the book should be. In conclusion, after analyzing the text, I do believe that this textbook was written very well. Of course, you do come across some flaws, which I have pointed out in the analysis that I did of some parts of the textbook. However, overall, I do believe that the textbook is an excellent example of a history textbook that could be used in an 11th grade classroom.